Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this event. I'm Anabel Quan-Haase, and I'm a professor at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies and Sociology here at Western. I'm also the director of the Socio-Digital Media Lab. And this event is the second part of the Rogers Chair in Studies in Journalism and New Information Technology. The event title is Disinformation on Social Media During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Prevalence and Journalistic Challenges. So I will start the event with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge as individuals and institutions that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chongontong nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that indigenous peoples endure in Canada. And we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. The land acknowledgement is very important to all of us and signals our awareness of injustices and willingness to engage in renewing respectful relationships. Next, I would like to introduce Sananda Sahu. Sananda is one of the PhD candidates in our media studies program here at FIMS. And she's also a former journalist herself. She's got lots of journalistic experience, and it includes work at the National in the Middle East, the Washington Bureau of McClatchy newspapers, and Times of India. So Sananda will be introducing today the speakers.
Thank you, Anabel. I'm excited to introduce our distinguished speakers today. Dr. Ahmed Al-Rawi is an assistant professor of news, social media, and public communication at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. He is the director of Disinformation project that empirically examines fake news discourses in Canada on social media and news media. His research expertise is related to social media, news, and global communication with emphasis on Canada and the Middle East. I had the opportunity to share a session with him in last year's Congress. We also have Lauren Pelley. Please welcome back Lauren to FIMS. It must be great to be here as a journalist. Pelley is an award-winning reporter with CBC News in Toronto. She's currently covering the COVID-19 pandemic with the National Health and Science team, and was previously a municipal affairs reporter for CBC Toronto and a staff reporter at the Toronto Star. She has a master's in journalism and a bachelor's in international relations from Western. We also have Dr. Alfred Hermida, who is a professor and former director at the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media at the University of British Columbia and co-founder of The Conversation Canada. His research addresses the transformation of news, media innovation, social media, and data journalism. His books include Data Journalism and the Regeneration of News, co-authored with Mary Lynn Young, and Tell Everyone Why We Share and Why It Matters. He was a BBC television, radio, and online journalist for 16 years, including 4 years in North Africa and the Middle East. And we also have Craig Silverman, who is an award-winning journalist and author and one of the world's leading experts on online disinformation, fake news, and digital investigations. He recently joined ProPublica as a reporter investigating voting, platforms, disinformation, and online manipulation. He received a George Polk Award in 2021 for a series of articles about Facebook. His 2019 series exposing a global Facebook advertising scam was also named Investigation of the Year by the Canadian Association of Journalists. Welcome, everyone. I now hand it over to Anabel.
Thank you so much, Sananda, for the amazing introductions. And I also want to very warmly welcome the panelists. And, we're very excited about the discussion today. I want to very briefly just explain how the event will be run. So during the event, I will set a number of different questions on a wide range of topics related to the main theme to the panelists. The panelists will be given an opportunity to address some of the questions, and then panelists will also be able to talk to each other at the end of each of the questions. So once we finalize the question and discussion period, we will open up the forum to everybody, to all the attendees, and we would like to ask you to please keep your questions, maybe write them down to the end. There is a Q&A part of our panel today where we really encourage everybody to ask their questions to the panelists, and you can either ask them to specific panelists or in general. All the questions, all the comments will be very welcome. So with that, I would like to get us started. So with the first question. So the WHO has identified the infodemic on social media as a key challenge for public health outreach. So what are the challenges for journalists associated with the just large amount of disinformation and information? It's hard to even figure out really what is what on social media, especially for the public. How do you see social media different in terms of, journalistic challenges in comparison to, let's say, television, news reporting in newspapers or other formats? And do you see specific features of social media? I'm thinking just something like likes, maybe a disinformation has 1,000 likes. Maybe people think, well, those 1,000 likes are a signal that this information is truthful or that it's worthwhile reading. So, what are we looking at here? So I don't know, maybe Greg, do you want to start on that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Great to be part of this event, and thank you for having me. Let me take sort of the first one here, which is, sort of challenges for journalists in dealing with this. And I think obviously one thing about the pandemic that was a challenge for everyone is it's just this completely new thing, right? There hadn't been a global pandemic in about a century. We have a novel virus that is deadly, that we still don't know a lot about, that is spreading rapidly. We don't know the origins of it. We don't know the best treatments. So that element of uncertainty just creates a really fertile environment for false and misleading information to spread, because there's a lot of fear, there's uncertainty. And so for journalists, just getting up to speed and to actually be debunking things when we know so little about a brand new virus is really hard. And it's also, in some ways, like it carries a lot of risk, because if you come down and you say, well, that's simply not true, and then 2 weeks later, new research comes out and all of a sudden it's like, well, actually now it's kind of in dispute, then you undermine the ability to be trusted in yourself. So I think that, just the nature of what this was made it really hard. So getting up to speed on it, being careful, not going, sort of beyond what we actually know. The fact that, a lot of newsrooms, we have science reporters if it's a large newsroom, but not every newsroom has that expertise. So lack of expertise. And then I think the scale is just a really big challenge when it came to COVID and still is today. I mean, the International Fact-Checking Network, with fact checkers around the world, they started collecting data, and you would see a claim, it might start in Taiwan, and within like 3 days, it's hit 15 or 20 other countries. And so, the spread of it, the speed of it, really challenging. So it was very difficult for journalists, I think, especially early on. And then as it evolved, it became hard because journalists often became a target of people who were spreading disinformation because they saw us as part of the big pharma, big government New World Order. So those are, some fairly significant challenges that I think we saw early and towards today.
Great, thank you. Lauren, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, social media has been such a fascinating public forum in this pandemic, for one thing. So let's talk about the good for a second, because it's been this way for people to share all these emerging ideas, for researchers to share early research as it's coming out in preprints. And, as Craig said, this was such a rapidly evolving situation that being able to have that real-time conversation and to be tapped into what scientists around the world were thinking about was incredibly helpful for health and medical reporters to sort of parse through, how this virus was evolving, how treatments were evolving, and how all the research was starting to shape up to give us a sense of how it would transmit and impact the public. On the flip side of that, you're dealing with just this massive amount of information and opinions ranging from, on one end of the spectrum, you have the more manipulative actors who are trying to, get a certain viewpoint out into the public for whatever, their reasoning is, all the way to people who are, buying into disinformation and misinformation, who are just, confused and trying to navigate a very terrifying, uncertain time, and then people who are trying to break through all that noise to say, okay, here's what we really know, here's the science, here are the facts. But it's all along this continuum. And sometimes I think we look at disinformation as, this something that's created by certain actors, but then you have all these other people in the middle just trying to navigate it. And for journalists, that was sort of the challenge, was being part of that movement of people who are trying to cut through the noise and find out what is the actual science here. That was a challenge, and it has been for the last 2 years, to break through all of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think your point about, the social media actually playing an important role is a really good one, because some of the research we did show that a number of the key accounts, including WHO, were very active early on. And I think social media hasn't played this kind of role in a global kind of crisis before that. So I think that is part of it. That was difficult to understand for some of these organizations, even for journalists. What role are we playing in all of this? So Alfred, did you want to add something to that as well?
Thank you. Yes, so thank you for inviting me to be here. It's great to be with all of you. I want to pick up both on what Craig and Lauren said about uncertainty. So one of the ways people deal with uncertainty is by spreading rumors and picking up on bits of information, the have you heard. Now, this is not people deliberately spreading information because they want to misinform, but rather they're trying to make sense of a very complex, evolving situation, which is, as Craig said, unparalleled in our lifetimes. So they might spread rumors about, have you heard, oh, can you get COVID from this? Or do masks help in these? Is it safe to send my kids to school? What we see then is these rumors getting additional fuel through social media. So they get amplified and spread in a way that is really quite unprecedented. And I'm always go back to say, social media isn't that old. We've had it for just over a decade. So we're really in a situation where the sort of discussions we might have with our friends about trying to make sense of a complex situation get amplified to a global audience through social media.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, my family is in the global south, and I would be getting a lot of that disinformation in the form often of infographics. And I was very surprised. I mean, I remember my father forwarding me one about, gurgling and with vinegar, I think. And I kept telling him, please, just don't follow these. And I mean, it was very difficult, to kind of explain that these infographics, even though they looked really kind of sophisticated, weren't actually produced by experts. So I think, the fact that social media is so new and that a lot of people couldn't really, even though it looked like expert made, that it actually wasn't expert advice, that was difficult to disambiguate for sure at the beginning. So yeah, Ahmed, did you want to add anything?
Thank you, Anabel, and thank you also for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think Craig, Alfred, and Lauren covered most of the issues, so I don't want to repeat the same things, but definitely social media allows people to disseminate messages far and wide due to their affordances, like the retweet feature, the like feature, the sharing feature. So it's really hard to control the misinformation going on today, unlike before. So again, as I said, this kind of misinformation will be definitely shared with other people who have similar ideas, and that's probably the danger of social media, creating some kind of clusters or filter bubbles and enhancing their beliefs. Funny thing, I just received today from Global South also fake news saying the International Criminal Court is going to try and is going to take Pfizer and Moderna to court because they have violated human rights, and the whole COVID thing is a fake. So just today, it's happening in different languages, not only English. Thank you, Anabel.
No, absolutely. And I think understanding also that global connectivity is something we haven't really studied anything at that scale, especially because news coverage often in the past has tended to be fairly local. So, we don't really know what it means when information can globally, as already pointed out, misinformation or disinformation created in Taiwan, having such a large impact in so many different regions. I think that's a unique. So my next question, though, specifically looks at the role of, I don't know if it's journalists, journalism, legacy media. We do know that a report that came out of the social media lab at it's now the Metropolitan Toronto University, did emphasize that many Canadians actually did go to legacy media during the COVID-19 pandemic. So my question here then is, what is the role of, what role do you see journalists playing in this landscape? What mechanisms could they use to help kind of discern, the different types of information? What do you see in terms of moving forward as well, maybe? So I don't know, Lauren, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. That's my role through the last 2 years, is being one of those journalists trying to navigate all this myself and explain it to the public. And I think, a lot of it has been capturing all the uncertainty, all the nuance of all the emerging research and findings, and translating science for the general public at a time in history when it's so easy to make anything sound scientific. Early on, when a lot of different drugs and treatments were being studied, the public had this barrage of information, right? Like hydroxychloroquine, maybe that works. Maybe ivermectin works. Maybe a certain type of steroid works. All of this was coming out, and it all sounds like science, right, on the surface. But for journalists, we were trying to parse through all that. Okay, what do the studies actually tell us about how these drugs are working? Which ones will be successful in saving lives down the road? But it's hard, when you're competing against all of that information on the internet, some of which is manipulated, used by certain actors to sort of paint this picture of what works and what doesn't. And we have to kind of cut through all that. So I think that's our job, is to really just stick to the science and to be, upfront about what we know, what we don't know, what the questions still are, and what all the nuances are of what, researchers are seeing on the ground. And I think another big thing that journalists, it was a responsibility, was getting into places where people were affected most by the pandemic, whether that was hospitals where there were patients, hooked up on a ventilator in the ICU, or into marginalized communities where we were starting to see much higher rates of COVID-19 infections and deaths. I think was almost the biggest thing that we really had to do in this, was showing people what was actually going on in their communities at a time too when a lot of that was closed off to us because of all the restrictions, the patient privacy policies. We really had to push to get in there and show people the impacts of COVID-19 on the ground. But that, I think, was incredibly important for people to understand, what this virus was doing in Canada and beyond.
No, and I think, Lauren, your point to I think one of the challenges here in the domain of journalism is, how do you report on uncertainty, on saying that, look, we may not, we don't know exactly how any of the treatments will work. That's very difficult, because people usually like certainty, they like knowledge, and there's certain assumptions about how science works that are very difficult to debunk. So conveying that, I can see how that would be very challenging. And one of the things I always teach about is the difference between journalism and citizen journalism, because, the idea that, citizen journalists, can play a huge role and maybe even take over the role of journalists. I think what you're saying is that in this case, for journalists to go to places where maybe the attention wasn't being drawn on, but that was really important to tell a story. Like that is an important part. And even recognizing that, like, where do we need to go? What stories are important to be told? And to me, that also goes often at the inequality, at that which is invisible, and that is very difficult to kind of shed light on. So I'm really, I think those are really important points. Ahmed, did you want to add something to this discussion?
Yes, thank you, Anabel. I think journalists' work is really delicate, sensitive, and very important during all times, but especially now with the pandemic. I mean, I don't envy their work. It's really hard, very tough. Some of the things I would like to highlight is the importance of holding people accountable, starting with the politicians, Trudeau, and ending up with the let's say, less important politicians. I think this is very important because without fact checking what politicians, and as well as other journalists, by the way, I rarely see this happening in Canada. Like, I rarely see journalists from CBC fact checking other journalists from other outlets. I wonder why, but I think it's important because sometimes people make mistakes, just like academics. So I believe that we need more scrutiny, and I think it's happening, but we need to do it more often. And this applies also to health authorities. They are not like, saying the truth. I mean, they don't know a lot of things, like what Craig mentioned in the beginning. There are so many things that we don't know so far about this pandemic. And sometimes they make mistakes. So it's okay to point these mistakes out and hold those people accountable, including the police, CSIS, and all the other important institutions. Another thing that with journalists is the shortcoming of what they call the false balance. Sometimes when journalists report on conspiracy theories, they want to interview the two parties, but actually the two parties are not equal. People who believe in conspiracies in Canada are, they constitute a minority. So you cannot just, give them equal weight or equal value. So I think we need to take that into account as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Anabel, I could jump in.
Oh yeah, absolutely, Alfred.
So, I always, when I'm with my students teaching them about journalism, I always say journalism is the art of the possible. And I think there's a broader question here in terms of how journalism as a profession, as a practice, deals with uncertainty. Because we're always looking to provide clear, factual, accurate, accessible information. The challenge with something like COVID, as we've seen with a lot of these complex problems we're facing, is it's hard to include all that complexity and nuance in a straightforward news story. If you think, with an academic paper, there'll be a big part of that paper that will say, here's the limitations. Now, imagine if you published a story about research on COVID and half of it was, well, it's only this size of patients who were treated. This is how the thing was conducted. Here's the things we don't know. It's journalism is not geared up to include all the limitations, because somebody will then say, well, you're telling me this is true, but then you're saying there's all these provisos around why it might not be true. And this is something that goes down to the profession and the practice of journalism. It's not geared up to include all this uncertainty when it's trying to provide certainty. And it's, journalists find it's a really tough line to tread on in terms of enough certainty, but acknowledging the uncertainty, especially when you have a novel disease like COVID-19.
I think to build off that, I think having, people who are trained in a newsroom on all of what you're just saying, Alfred, is so important. Like, you need people with a background in health and medical reporting or a background in science itself to be able to cover stories that way. Because that's a tenet of science journalism, is to cover those caveats, those limitations. And it might make a headline a little bit less click-worthy, but you have to do that. I think some of the problems that you're raising here often stem from, when political journalism is covering a health story and things like that, where it can start to blur those lines between what is the science telling us and what are we seeing, in public opinion and politics and all these things. But if you're focusing on, science and accuracy, you can kind of filter those stories through that lens of what do we know, what are the limitations, what are the questions that still need to be answered, Even if, on the surface, new research or a COVID development seems like a slam dunk, it rarely is, you have to be asking those questions.
Absolutely. Plus, the one thing I like about being an academic is that we can write 8,000 words or more. I think journalists are very also, like the fact that the stories are short, especially now on social media. I mean, if you consider that Twitter often is seen as kind of, the place of knowledge, it's kind of surprising. Yeah, Craig, did you want to add to the discussion?
Well, I mean, there was a second sort of part to the question, which is about mechanisms for countering the disinformation, which is obviously, there aren't simple, easy solutions on that because, I think a fundamental thing that people should understand about disinformation is that, it reflects the kinds of the fears, the challenges, the problems, the fractures in our societies. And that's when it can really find, a place to grow and spread. And that's when people start to latch on to false and misleading narratives. It fills a need for them. It fills a void in their life. It answers questions. And so, it connects to this discussion about how difficult it is, and typically the challenge that journalists have in communicating uncertainty. And I think during the pandemic, that was even magnified even more because, look, the WHO got things wrong, and major institutions got things wrong because of how difficult this was. And when they would plant their flag and say this, certain positions on masking early on, were reversed later. And then when you think about the people who have a vested interest in, undermining quality information, so people who are already anti-vaccine, they seize upon that. That is their opportunity because they don't put uncertainty in their narratives. They actually seek to explain everything. They seek to make it very clear and very simple and very shareable and very consumable. And so, so I think we have to understand, if we're going to counter this stuff, the needs they fill, the opportunities, the things that the bad actor seize upon. And I do think in newsrooms, I do a lot of training for journalists around kind of investigating disinformation, and that training is still on the most basic level, not widespread in newsrooms. And you don't need to be a disinformation reporter to do, understand these basic techniques. And I think that's something we need to do. And then also it's an education challenge for the public. We have a very new information environment. It is scrolling and screen-based and things that are very different. We forget that the smartphone, is only from 2007, and things have changed very quickly. And so I do think we also need to think about, from all age ranges, how we help people navigate this world and pause before they share and think about where is this information coming from and think about their own emotional reaction to it. Those are some of the ways I think we start to suppress it a bit. And of course, doing the debunking and helping, put that in front of people, I think is helpful, but in and of itself, it's not enough. We need to think about reshaping how people navigate this new and abundant information universe.
And Craig touches on a really important point, which is the broader context here, that there is a global crisis in trust. Every year, Edelman does a trust survey. I was looking at the results for 2022. You have globally half of citizens who don't trust their government, with the figure even lower in countries where you've got very divisive politics, as we've seen in the US, we're seeing in the UK, and we're seeing now in countries like Germany as well. So when you have this global crisis in trust, and when only just over 50% of people trust the media, and when governments and media are seen as divisive by citizens, then that places such an onus on journalism to try to provide reliable information while acknowledging that people may not necessarily trust them. So it's imperative then to understand, why is it you don't trust us? What is it that we can do to regain that trust, and understand where people are coming from? So I think there's only so much journalism can do here, because we're playing in a much bigger situation where this global crisis of trust is really undermining the ability of journalists to play their role in society.
Thank you, Anabel. Thanks, Alfred. I completely agree with this point. That's why probably we need third actors or players or parties like fact checkers non-partisan fact checkers who can help journalists and fact check also news organizations as well as politicians. We don't have that a lot in Canada. We see this mostly in the United States, but I think we need to have distinct entities, associations, groups of fact checkers who would be able to aid journalists in this work and restore some kind of trust and faith in journalism, which is definitely something we need these days. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And just to add to that point, while we were doing our research, one of the things that we found is that trust often is there for some of the health institutions like the WHO. So, I mean, I don't know, I see just from the conversation here about the mechanisms, potentially, you know, a good kind of collaboration here between, you know, journalism, the legacy media, being the conveyors of and the translators of some of that kind of research and information that is, you know, provided by entities like, you know, like the CDC or the NHS, you know, and so on. So we found in our research that those organizations were very trusted, but they're not often very well trained in disseminating, you know, knowledge to the public. So I don't know, just coming out of this conversation, I think that that's kind of a thought that I had. So, but along similar lines, my next question actually deals with something we kind of started talking about, but I think that, you know, it's something that is at the heart of what we do at FIMS, and in particular in our health information science program, which we often call knowledge translation. I know it's kind of a very academic term, but it's the question of what unique challenges do journalists confront with translating, you know, and I think, Lauren, you already mentioned that science information in such a way that is understandable to the public. And I think we've talked already about some of the issues here, like the complexity of, you know, health information related to a unique virus like COVID-19. We had Zika before, but some of these, you know, there were very different dynamics here, I would say. Also, you know, one of the things we talked about is the rapid change, you know, during COVID and with the new variants. So it's kind of very difficult to do the knowledge translation piece when things are changing so quickly. And also here, I mean, I know that even for myself, one of the challenges I had is the translation of numerical literacy, you know, in terms of what do the COVID-19 numbers mean? What is the modeling, the probabilities of spread? And how does it translate into behaviors? Like, should I be seeing a friend or not? Should I be sending my kids to school or not? So I don't know if I know this is a very complex question, so I apologize, it has so many subcomponents, but I guess it's to do with, you know, yeah, and I think, Lauren, you were saying you're obviously working in this domain of knowledge translation, but how do we play that role? So I don't know, Alfred, do you want to comment there first, perhaps?
Well, thank you for this. It's interesting because I wrote a chapter with a colleague from Oslo Met, Oscar Westland, on this, on the use of data journalism and COVID in particular. Because when journalists use data, there's a certain sense of, well, if it's numbers, it must be true. There's sort of an inbuilt bias towards truth because we have the numbers. But of course, numbers can lie. We all know that. The challenge with COVID is for journalists getting access to the relevant and reliable data, but then also having the expertise to process, interpret, and present it in a way that's meaningful. So one example would be when we have the numbers for COVID in the community. Well, obviously, then those numbers depend on testing. And if testing is capped at a certain number, then obviously you're going to get less results in terms of in the community. So the numbers of people infected with COVID in the community are meaningless because you're not actually testing everybody. So it's things like this that then make it very hard, like you said, for individuals to assess the risk. And people are notoriously terrible at assessing risk because a figure can sound really scary, but actually the risk to you individually might be quite minimal. So there is a real challenge here around numerical literacy and being able to put all these figures in context, and sometimes to say, the provincial health authorities have released this figure, but actually it's not really an accurate representation because of all these caveats.
I'd love to just build off what Alfred said. I can't agree more. And I think there's a common thread in all of this where we often talk about misinformation and disinformation from certain groups, certain actors, but it can sort of start with reliable sources like the government in a way. So the testing example is fantastic because, you know, as journalists, we can take those raw numbers and say, here are all those caveats. We're testing far less than we ever have. So how do we know how big this wave is? Here's all the other signals we can be looking at things like wastewater testing, you know, at-home rapid tests that are sometimes collected, aside from just the PCR testing the government collects. Another example of that jumps to my mind is the Ontario government released these pie charts of hospitalizations with COVID and the percentage of who was vaccinated, who wasn't. Now, a pie chart, math, is 100%, right? That's the pie. So if you look at that at first glance, it's overwhelming. The majority of people ending up in hospital with COVID are fully vaccinated. So it's easy to take that data from a government website, post it on the internet, and say, look at this, you know, we have this horrible crisis where the vaccines don't work and people are dying in droves, et cetera. And I've had that shared with me many, many times. To the numerical literacy point, once you understand the rate at which that's happening and the numerator and the denominator showing just how many people are vaccinated in Ontario, it's around 90% of Ontarians are vaccinated, whether that's above 12 or the eligible amount of Ontarians. So basic math, you can see the rates of that it's actually overwhelmingly, you know, unvaccinated people who are getting sicker with COVID. But if you look at that pie chart, as many Canadians would, and honestly, the first time I glanced at it, I was like, something feels off here. This is, you know, the raw numbers telling me a story. But the real story, once you understand that broader context, is different from what that one chart is showing you. So again, I think that's where journalists can step in. That's an official government website. It's been unchanged since the beginning, since they released it. And it's on us to sort of unpack that and help the public understand what that really is telling them. And that's not easy to do when you're also up against people who take that data and manipulate it to back up whatever their argument is.
Absolutely. And I mean, I spend probably too much time on Twitter, but I do see a lot of that where data is used out of context to tell a story. And unless you really understand the statistics or know more about, you know, the reporting, it can be confusing for sure to kind of understand what the data is actually really telling us. And I think the other problem is, you know, data versus anecdotes. And I think often, you know, we hear a lot of anecdotes that kind of then make it difficult for people to believe the larger data picture. So Greg, did you have anything to add to this?
Well, just, you know, one quick thing I'll add is that there is kind of a tradition among journalists and in newsrooms, and I think it's gotten a lot better, but it's almost like, well, I'm a journalist, I don't do math. Like you would hear people say that in newsrooms. And I think it's gotten a lot better because now, you know, there are engineers in newsrooms, there are data scientists in newsrooms. So we've expanded the skill set that we sort of bring in. But, you know, I remember, and I forget the year it was done, but there was a survey done of journalists, and this was, you know, a few decades ago, where they asked to rate how good they thought they were at math. And most of them, you know, gave themselves a fairly low rating. But then they actually did a math test and they weren't as bad as they said they thought they were. And so it was almost like this concept of, well, I'm a journalist, I don't do math. And you know, and that has been, I think, a really harmful thing for the profession overall. I do think that it's receding, but it sort of gets exposed in a scenario like this, where you need people in newsrooms, you know, who are checking the graphics, checking the charts, reading the sentences. In everyone's story, all of a sudden, everybody's writing about COVID, right? And the level of scientific background and the knowledge of how to frame these numbers properly, you end up having to basically have, you know, someone like, you know, Lauren, who would understand this stuff, having to look over other people's work. And I remember that when I was at BuzzFeed News, our newsroom turned into a COVID newsroom. And our science editor had to start reading everyone's copy before it went up online because, you know, were we expressing things properly, until they figured out a better workflow. And so, you know, if anything, I hope that this maybe creates a blossoming in newsrooms of some more numeracy training and valuing these kinds of skills, because they traditionally have not been valued as much as they should be in newsrooms.
Oh, I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, it's hard to change curriculum. I mean, we all know how that works at the university level. It has to go through so many levels of approval, but certainly maybe one of the takeaway messages is, like I think at FIMS, one of the advantages, we're a very interdisciplinary program. So we have a health information science program and a master's journalism program. So maybe this is, a call for more integration, more interdisciplinary than we already have. At least, as somebody who works with data, I feel like that would be a welcome. So yeah, Ahmed, did you want to add to the numeracy, to the knowledge translation piece question?
Yeah, this is very important. I think I agree with everything mentioned here. I would like just to add one point with regard to caution when it comes to reporting on scientific issues. Because today in the academic world, we have different types of publications. So we have a whole new world called the preprints. Preprints are non-peer-reviewed studies that have not been checked by other experts. The problem that is happening today is that a lot of these preprints are being already reported on in the news media, and that's probably very dangerous. We talk about being more familiar, being more cautious when reporting about these non-peer-reviewed studies. That's, I think, very important during a pandemic. Yeah, I think that's my main point. And also the other issue with regard to being cautious when it comes to interviewing self-proclaimed experts. In today's world, there are so many experts out there. So I think journalists need to do more research before they, talk to so-called self-proclaimed experts, because they can actually ruin the whole news report. Thank you.
Well, Ahmed, that is a very good segue to my next question, because a research report came out that suggested that most of the disinformation on social media came from a few sources, so what we call the influencers. So what role do you see people like Robert F. Kennedy, again, playing in this infodemic? And I mean, I saw some interviews of Robert F. Kennedy on mainstream media. So I was quite surprised there. I mean, as you just mentioned, like being interviewed, and I understand maybe you're an expert in politics, but would you interview someone who's a politician on questions around, the spread of a virus? So again, what role, like, how do we, what role could journalism play in terms of, maybe reducing the influence of the influencers? I don't know, is that the right way of framing the question, I guess?
Yeah, well, thank you, Anabel, for the question. I read the study that was published online. I have great respect for the people who wrote it, but I have also doubts about the claims made. I honestly don't think that they call it the dozens, the dozen who are involved in spreading misinformation about the vaccine. I don't think it's only the 12 people. Why not 10? Why not 9? I think it's worse than what has been presented. I'm not saying that influencers have no impact on the audience. They do have, because they have huge following. But I think the issue of misinformation is widely spread, and so many people are engaged in or involved in spreading it. So I don't think focusing on a few people only will tell us a lot about the infodemic. It's worse than only few people. Now, talking about the role, I think the tech companies should do more when it comes to at least flagging these kinds of controversial pieces of information. They have to do more. I don't think they are doing enough. I mean, Twitter as well as Facebook have been now more active after public pressure, but they need to do more by, for example, hiring more human moderators and working more on advancing their AI tools, so that such kind of conspiracies or controversial pieces of information will be instantaneously flagged for the audiences. This is not yet happening. From my own research on Instagram and elsewhere, like this kind of misinformation about different things related to COVID or even politics is really widespread, especially on Twitter. I mean, I know there is a lot of, let's say, public discussion about Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, but I'm seeing Twitter to be the most problematic platform, one of the most problematic platforms. And now with Elon Musk, I don't know what will happen afterwards. You know, talking about the solution, honestly, I don't think deplatforming those people, even if there are only a dozen of them, will solve the problem. The problem is widespread. And those people, if deplatformed, they will go elsewhere, like Getter, Parler, BitChute, and so on. They will not be silenced, in other words. What I think should be done here is probably limit the outreach of those people, limit the dissemination of their messages. But I don't think deplatforming them will be the solution.
You made a really good point. Thank you, Anabel. Because it's not just about moderation, but also the speed of transmission. You know, like basically, disinformation is highly transmissible because people want to believe it and often want to spread something that aligns with their worldview. So it's almost saying, well, yes, there can be moderation and fact checking, but another way of thinking about it is speed limits on the spread of this information. Because it's not just, I look at social media platforms like Twitter, and the power is not just being able to publish something, but to amplify it. And I think that becomes then the really big issue here with disinformation, when you have an influencer who's able to tap into an amplification network. So I would say part of the solution here would be to say, can we try to slow down the spread of this disinformation, slow down the speed of that transmission to help corrective forces come in and say, no, no, this is actually not true.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the way I see it is that some of these approaches are counter to the, you know, to the platform's kind of aim of, you know, revenue generation and amplification. So, and absolutely. So, I mean, to your point, I think the one study I looked at, only about 6% of problematic posts were removed by some of the platforms. And in my view, they do have the, you know, they do have the technology. It's just that they don't have really the motivation. Exactly. So yeah. So Greg, did you want to add something to this point?
Well, I mean, so two things. One, to sort of talk about influencers. You know, we talked earlier about like the need that disinformation or other things fill. And I think influencers do fill a need in the ecosystem, in the sense that, you know, people look for someone to be a leader or an elite in their community, right? And this happens in the mainstream world of like political elites and media elites and other people. And so if you're going to create kind of an alternative information ecosystem, an alternative universe, you've got to have your elites and your leaders. And so they can be really quite important and quite influential. They can set the tone. And someone like, you know, Kennedy has been kind of banging the anti-vax drum for a very long time and wasn't really a topic of mainstream conversation. But the pandemic was his moment. And so you had people like him and others who seized this and in their biggest way possible. And so this is where, you know, they became more influential than they had been before. And there was also efforts to kind of create influencers out of nothing, like Judy Mikovits, who was kind of the star of the disinformation-filled film Plandemic. She was just a disgraced researcher until the pandemic came along, right? And so I think they are important. And you know, the second thing is, and I think we've agreed a lot on this panel, so let me actually strike one tone of possible disagreement around deplatforming. I think there are examples where it has worked and been effective and been necessary, in the sense that, you know, if you have rules, and a big problem with these platforms is they have rules, but they do a very uneven and unequal job of enforcing them, right? And that cuts across a lot of things. Geographically, certain countries get way more oversight than others. You know, depending on where you live in the world, Meta and Twitter and other people may have people that speak the language and can actually review posts, and they may not, you know, or they may have a couple of people. And that's a really unequal situation. But if there are rules, then at a certain point, someone who is consistently breaking the rules and flouting them and doing so clearly on purpose, at a certain point, they probably got to go, right? And so, you know, and so, yes, there are alternative platforms, the Parlers, the Getters, the Rumbles, which is a Canadian founded company. But typically their audience is much less. And what a lot of these folks really thrive on is getting to be out there in front of the larger population. They want to be on the biggest platforms because they want to bring people to them and they want to have that potential for a big audience. So yes, restricting algorithmic distribution of them as early steps, flagging and labeling, absolutely. You want to take that before you actually remove things. But at a certain point, deplatforming for people who are the most extremists, they sort of lose their rights to be part of an environment if they simply cannot adhere to the rules. And I think that is something that happens. And I think there are plenty of examples of people like Milo and others who were part of a more mainstream conversation, and then they got deplatformed and they've really gone off into fringe areas and people don't really pay as much attention to them anymore. And it has been effective in some cases.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. And I don't know, the influence of influencers is a big question. And I think hopefully we'll get more data on that, on how to address some of these issues. So, I mean, we're almost at the end of our panel discussion, but I do have a very, to me, important and more personal question. So I follow on Twitter Kate Dubinsky, who's a CBC London reporter. And I remember that during the pandemic, she would tweet out a lot of pictures of her writing stories on COVID in her bathroom because her kids were working from home. And it was just, I really admired her. I don't know if I would be able to write my research papers sitting in the bathroom, but one of the questions I had, what are the challenges for journalists? That what did you encounter by working from home? Was there some kind of burnout? I mean, I heard a lot of trying to just catch up with the facts. Maybe what if you publish something that wasn't right? How do you? Because I've done that. I actually published once a paper and we had some data that wasn't correct and we had to retrieve it. And I mean, I remember it being very stressful just because you want to be right as a scholar. So how do you manage some of that? So my other question in terms of a journalistic challenge that I've heard is also online harassment. So scientists were harassed, journalists, were being harassed on social media. So, what could be done to better support journalists in the future in their professional practice, in your view? And maybe I'll start, Lauren.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to is, journalists are humans. So we were living through the pandemic and covering it just, like anyone else. When it comes to the online harassment piece, that's certainly ramped up in the pandemic. The amount of conspiracy theories, hate mail, death threats, you name it, the whole spectrum. I think a lot of us who've covered COVID-19 and other issues, it's pretty much a constant at this point. So I think organizations, I know CBC has been very supportive of keeping that dialogue open with their staff. And I hope all organizations are doing that to make sure that people feel supported, that they have avenues to report actually dangerous messages and whatnot. So I think, there needs to be mental health supports in place because this can actually be quite a burden on people's mental health when they're dealing with that kind of messaging day to day. So I think, those are the pieces organizations can put in place. And I think more are starting to do it. But, there also needs to be a legal piece of it. If it is actually something that's a threat on someone's life, you need the systems in place to mitigate that. But I think just my final comment would be, again, journalists were living through this like everyone else and trying to bring those really human stories to the forefront. So that was, exhausting. And I know journalists who've covered wars and whatnot in the past have spoken about PTSD from, living through that. And I found, this was an interesting experience of the months passing and interviewing person after person who was in an ICU or had lost a loved one, stories of people, a personal support worker bringing it home from long-term care into their home, their husband gets it, he passes away. These were the stories that we would cover, and we would meet these people over and over and over. So that I found was one of the challenges, was maintaining that momentum as a journalist to keep covering this very, specific beat for, at this point, years, while also carrying that burden of, those personal stories and accounts, while you're worried about your own loved ones falling sick from this mysterious new virus. So that was sort of an interesting experience. But again, I think it speaks to the need for organizations to understand that their staff will be burnt out. They will be dealing with some mental health challenges. they will be dealing with all this online harassment, and to have systems in place to support them so that we can keep doing what I think is incredibly important work to help the public navigate all of this.
And to be honest, I think, well, first of all, thank you for all of the work you've done. So, and, you know, I do acknowledge some of the challenge, you know, just the burden. I mean, I wonder to what extent, you know, maybe also journalists as a profession, usually, you know, they don't have the kind of training that, let's say, a psychologist or psychiatrist has to kind of, you know, manage and kind of self-reflect on some of the emotional burden. So, you know, as you're saying, maybe the role of institutions to provide more of that support is important. And I do know that, you know, some of the research that has been done, in particular, acknowledging issues of gender and intersectionality, is that often, you know, online harassment and things like that fall often on, you know, often the targets are, you know, women, racialized individuals, racialized women. And the danger there to me always is the fact that through that harassment, often, unfortunately, those who create that harassment actually achieve their goal of silencing people, right? Silencing certain individuals, certain opinions, certain voices. So I feel like that's a very important topic to kind of address, not only at an individual level, but a much larger kind of institutional level. So that's really interesting to hear. Yeah, Craig, did you want to, I know you're also working, you know, so I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are here.
You know, I think Lauren summed up some of the really key things around support, around harassment, around threats in newsrooms. That's an area that only the largest and wealthiest newsrooms tend to have support in. And it is very unevenly distributed, especially to smaller newsrooms, independent newsrooms, local newsrooms. So that to me is the really big glaring piece there, because otherwise it's sort of like, yes, you know, journalists got burned out, but a lot of people got burned out over the pandemic. And so, you know, I think then there's also just sort of thinking as a society, well, what are the factors and what are the problems that were shown by the pandemic? Yes, this was a rare kind of event, but maybe it is an opportunity to think about what kind of support every Canadian should have. You know, not just journalists, but yes, a very specific thing for us has been harassment, intimidation, attacks, and threats. And that's a place that newsrooms really need to put more resources and support into.
Thank you, Anabel. Just one thing to add to what Craig and Lauren mentioned is the fact that sometimes even academics get harassment. I mean, you know, writing for the conversation. I know Alfred has been involved in launching it. Has been challenging, actually. I got a lot of hate mails, and the same applies when I do interviews for the CBC and elsewhere. I get a lot of it's like a campaign, mostly by the anti-vaxxers and other ones, and it is ongoing. But it's not really easy for academics to get all of these hate mails. So again, we talk about whether there is institutional support or not, and so on. But I think we are all in this together. We are working all together. Journalists on the one hand taking the heavy weight, but also academics and scientists. They are trying also to let's say, help and support the journalists in their work. Thank you.
And medical professionals as well, to add on to that, especially the ones who were the most public and gave the most time to the media so we could disseminate to the public. They deserve, you know, a lot of praise for taking quite a bit of heat and hate mail themselves as well.
I mean, Bonnie Henry is the example. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and I think hopefully, I don't know how to address that, but to me, the danger, of course, is the silencing of important voices, the silencing of science, of knowledge. So to really understand this and address it seems, you know, critically important moving forward. So at this point, I do want to thank our panelists, you know, for all your thoughts, you know, your opinions. You know, we really appreciate you being here today. I also want to take this opportunity to thank an entire team who's worked behind the scenes to make this happen. So first of all, Sananda Saho for being a part of the organization, and to Becky Blue, who's done an incredible amount of work disseminating the event and putting it together. to Matt Ward and Charlotte McLean. So thank you to all of you for all your work behind the scenes. We so much appreciate it and are extremely grateful, of course, to FIMS and to the Rogers Chair. And hopefully I didn't forget anything, but with that, I would like to now open it. We have a few more minutes for the Q&A, and I already see some questions. So the way that the Q&A will work is I will be reading out the questions, and then panelists, you're very welcome to raise your hand and answer, in any questions that you would like to address. So this is by Krista Jamieson. I'm wondering if the panelists can address the issue of outdated information and how that contributes to misinformation. After 2 years of pandemic, a lot of information hasn't come down from the internet. Googling information brings up a lot of old information that is hard to parse through and unclear when it's out of date and what is the most accurate, up-to-date information. So clearly an informational question here in terms of maybe that's even archiving of news stories. I'm thinking of CBC, there's a lot of archiving and so on. So thank you, Krista, for that.
I can just, one thing that I can speak to that, like, obviously it's true. Old stories, old information typically is not removed from the internet. It's one of the benefits of sort of our global archive, but yes, there can be drawbacks. And if we talk specifically about Google, if you're searching for information, Google is obviously deciding what things to put up high. And, Google has some efforts, for example, if you are a sort of recognized fact-checking organization and you are labeling your fact checks in a certain way, Google is making an effort to surface those higher in certain results where it's relevant. And so this is kind of less a problem of sort of there being old, out-of-date information and more around, well, what is Google showing you when you're searching? What are the search engines prioritizing and bringing up? And it also could highlight areas where the media, because it's sometimes our tendency, we jump on something early on and then we don't come back to it and update and give newer content about it. So it could be a scenario of, what you're searching for and how Google is choosing to order and show results. And they are trying to put more recent and, credible stuff up high. And it may also be a case where you're searching for things where, there was early coverage early on for whatever reason, but maybe, news organizations, others haven't come back to it. That's something that can be a fault of journalists and news organizations. Something comes out early on and we don't always necessarily go back and write the follow-up stories. But certainly in terms of what you get in search results, Google is making very big decisions about what it does and doesn't show.
Well, we all know that is based mostly on linkages. At least, well, it's such an obscure algorithm, but it could be, of course, if an older story has more links, just because a newer story is more recent, it may be less likely to show up. But Alfred, I'll let you.
Thank you, Anabel. And you're seeing media organizations essentially labeling old stories. So right at the top, saying to readers, this story is from 2 years ago. Because what tends to happen when people are browsing is you don't even see the date. You see the headline, you see the first paragraph, you see the images. So there's an onus then on journalists to be very clear and say, no, this is out of date, perhaps even when the results appear on Google, to be able to say this is a story from 2 years ago.
Alfred, it's so funny you mentioned that because it's happened to me a number of times where I've read a 2 or 3 year old story on CBC, Lauren, mostly on the smartphone, and where I've been very surprised because I was like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. And when I look it up, it turns out that it's 2 years old. And I'm not quite sure how the CBC algorithm works, but obviously it sometimes does push really, kind of archived stories. But yeah, very good point. So here from an anonymous attendee, what impact do you think Bill C-10 with regards to combating misinformation around COVID and other issues will have? Okay, we'll move on. The next question I have is from Nicolas Facio. So have we learned any strategies for when fact-checking is not enough, especially in a situation where accurate information is a matter of life and death, as in the pandemic? And a follow-up, do you think that the disappearance of trust in institutional media is largely attributable to communication technologies, that is to the internet, or is it attributable to social forces as well, such as underfunding of public education, the absence of a widely shared definition of truth, and the privatization of traditional news outlets? Yes, Ahmed.
Thank you, Anabel. I'll probably address the second question about trust and what exactly disappearance in trust in institutional media and in general. I think we talk about today interest groups. There are so many interest groups out there whose job is to cast doubt about different institutions. So, for example, the oil and gas industry has its own groups whose job is to show that, for example, climate change is not happening. So they are trying to cast doubt about legitimate things that we know there is some kind of scientific consensus about. In the past, the tobacco industry used to do this. Today, we have the vaping industry doing something similar in Canada and elsewhere. So these are all like groups whose interest is to, make people mistrust institutions. Sometimes it's run by nation states. So we have, for instance, foreign-run trolls that are trying to also make foreign audiences doubt their institutions and their democratic like foundations. So this is what is happening today. It's like an ongoing information warfare in which so many parties are involved in trying to cast doubt about legitimate institutions like our democracy. And that's where we have this challenge. So the point I'm making here is not only social media, there are other bad actors, bad players involved in this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ahmed. Anyone else?
I'll just add on, like, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, to me, it's a little bit of human nature just playing out on this global scale now. We've never been so interconnected. We've never before had, an internet and globalization and the ability to move ideas and people around the world. And it just, I think that has changed the game. There's a bit of, there was gossip in villages, hundreds of years ago, but now we just have a system in place where all of this can spread so much faster. And personally, I'm not sure how we solve some of the downsides of that, because we've created a world where it's hard to untangle all of that now. And there's so many upsides to it as well that would we even want to?
I was just going to add on the first question there about when fact checking is not enough. I mean, I think it's important to be realistic about what fact checking can and can't do. It's not going to change somebody's mind on a deeply held belief on something that is core to their identity and who they are, on knowledge that they have kind of accumulated and come to really, believe over the span of a long span of time. So there are lots of situations where, a single fact check is not necessarily going to do a lot on its own. And so being realistic about that is, I think, really important. And, in situations where accurate information is a matter of life and death, I think in that case, it's not just about framing it as fact checking, but about getting as many people and institutions and organizations as possible putting credible information out there. It's not just about fact checks here and there. It's about whole of society efforts with the best information possible. And so, yeah, I mean, there was a sort of fad, and fact checking has grown an amazing amount, which is great, but let's also be realistic. It can be effective, but there's lots of scenarios in which it's not going to change someone's mind. Don't expect it to do that. Don't expect it to, have a magic bullet effect, but it can have some effect, and we've seen research to show that.
And to pick up on what Craig and Lauren have been talking about, fact checking can be counterproductive. Telling somebody they're wrong can serve to reinforce their position. And I think this also ties into the sort of the social aspect of social media. Social media is about identity. It's about who you are, who you represent. So part of what you're doing through social media is saying, this is who I am, these are my beliefs, these are my lived experiences. I think in that situation, fact checking is even harder because you're telling somebody the way they see their world is wrong, especially when they can find others like them and connect to them and reinforce that worldview. So there is also something about social media and the social aspect, how it's tied into personal identity, that makes this an even larger challenge.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting discussion because I gave a talk to a group of older Canadians. So they were like, kind of like, it's called third age learning. And when I talked about fact checkers, they were so enthusiastic because I think from their point of view, they want to know what's true, right? They really want to know the science. So they're very eager to be able to figure out what is the right information. And when I said that they were, fact checking websites where you could see that, they were so eager. So I think there's clearly, I think, Alfred, you're talking about a group that kind of is not that interested maybe in figuring out what the real science is, but those who are, I think fact checkers, if we could make them more part of the digital literacy, could actually work quite well. So we have another question here. So thank you so far for engaging with all these questions. So this is from Tom Streeter. A question for all the panelists. Were Iraqi WMDs trumpeted in the lead up to the US invasion of Iraq disinformation? If no, what's the difference? If yes, what do we make of the fact that this disinformation was disseminated by the New York Times, among other legitimate sources? Ancient history, I know, but it is living memory for many of us. Yeah.
I have to say that I have to speak because I'm an Iraqi actually, and I was living in Iraq during the invasion, and I'm like the outcome of fake news. The fact that I'm here is because of fake news. So totally true. This is definitely true. Ironically, the term, as Craig reported back in 2016, the term fake news became very popular with Trump and the US election. But I kept on thinking, and I even asked Craig a couple of years ago when I interviewed him, like, what about the Iraqi war? Why didn't we talk about it? Why wasn't it in the public discourse? I'm not sure, like I have my own interpretation of it, but it was not a big thing. It was not a real serious matter until it actually touched or affected the United States. So that's a bit unfair to tell you the truth. But again, the outcome of that kind of incident is still seen today in the Middle East and elsewhere. Yeah, thank you.
So the question was, is that an example of disinformation? I mean, I would say yes. I think, there were people in, what was it called? The Office of Special Plans that was created by a bunch of people who already believed that Iraq had or was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. They had made up their minds, and then they torqued the intelligence that was coming in to make it, to give the answer that they wanted. So, yeah, I certainly make no excuses for that. I think it's one of the tragedies of this century so far, right? And then also, the media absolutely fell for that hook, line, and sinker. What's amazing about it is, and conveys how much, and the American press really just sort of went for that at the time, is that I know that of all of the outlets, among the very few was one called McClatchy, which was actually raising questions about the quality of this intelligence. And that tells you how many people in the media were amplifying this, because the name of like the one that wasn't. That's how widespread it was at the time. And so, I think when we talk about trust in the media and why has it declined in the United States or other places, yes, when you have scenarios like that where the job of the journalists should have been to point out the flaws in that intelligence, but the drumbeat for war was found in pretty much all of the major publications in the US. And today, when the US is calling out things that Russia is doing in Ukraine, what does Russia point to? They point to Colin Powell's speech at the UN, holding up the bullshit vial spreading these claims. And Colin Powell did not, I don't think he knew that it was completely bogus. He was working with, you know, what the administration had fed him, and apparently he edited a lot of it, but it was still, you know, probably one of the worst moments in UN history of that speech, because it galvanized a lot of support for that war as well.
If I could step in, it also speaks to the way journalists handle these types of stories. I think to the Brexit campaign in the UK, where, you know, the Brexiteers were talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that were going to the health service as a result of Brexit, campaigning with a big bus slogan. And that bus was in every news report, even though the figure wasn't credible. But journalists were really struggling to sort of cover this, represent both sides, but caught into that both-sidism that, okay, well, one side says this, one side says that, where actually, no, one side is kind of lying. They're distorting the truth to fit their world vision. And I think part of the role of journalists is to call that out. The risk in a highly polarized and political environment is that journalists then get accused of political bias and undermining their impartiality. So in some ways, part of the challenge here is how do you operate as a journalist in a highly polarized environment where politicians are making claims that are plainly false. We've seen this in the UK with Boris Johnson repeatedly, essentially lying to Parliament about parties at Downing Street during COVID, and continuing to say with a straight face that I wasn't aware there was a party, even though there were drinks and a cake and everybody was there. You know, it's sort of, for me, as a Brit who came through the British journalism system, it beggars belief that we have politicians who repeatedly lie and don't say, oh, sorry, you caught me in a lie, it's fine. And journalists did their job by pointing out that was not true. But it speaks to this broader environment in which we're operating, where, you know, there's something wrong with the information system we're in.
Well, Tom, thank you for the question, because I always say that you can't look at anything without looking at the historical context, you know, the continuity, and also understanding, you know, the current social context. So that, yeah, thanks for bringing that in. So our next question is from Bob Hackett. And Bob says, is anybody discussing the commercial design of corporate digital networks, especially Facebook, with profitability related to provoking rage and fear to attract clicks, likes, and the like? That is, the problem is a structural one related to digital capitalism. Is there a structural policy solution? Fact-checking and partial deplatforming of selected individuals seems like effective by comparison. Less effective by comparison. Oh yeah, Alfred.
I'm happy to step in there. Thank you for the question, Bob. Well, you know, we need to remember that, you know, Facebook, Twitter, these are not platforms there to serve the public interest. They're not there to provide reliable news and information. They're there to grab our attention, keep users engaged, sell our data, and sell to advertisers. You know, they're motivated by profit. And obviously, they're going to do things that try to maximize that attention and profit. So, you know, I always think of social media as, you know, they trade in emotion, they trade in empathy, they trade in lived experiences. These are the things that sell on social. Evidence, not so much. And this is where sort of journalism and fact-checking comes into place. We're trying to provide evidence in a space where actually other factors are prioritized and built into the way that network operates. It doesn't operate like a news organization. And that's essentially the challenge here for journalists and fact-checkers operating in those spaces.
Thank you, Alfred. Okay, I will move on to the next question. So this is by Billy Hollingshead. First, in this age of mis and disinformation, are we experiencing a larger crisis of what is considered knowledge, particularly what is considered fact and legitimate? It seems to me that part of the issue is that these bubbles of disinformation begin to constitute fundamentally alternative realities. that appear at times unbridgeable. That is, the sorts of narratives generated from the so-called Freedom Convoy in Ottawa. And secondly, how do we reasonably address this problem as a multi-stakeholder issue of social media platforms, moderating content, scientific actors, health organizations, journalists, news organizations, and so on? Long question.
I mean, the thing that I would say is like, are we experiencing a larger crisis of what's considered knowledge? Yeah, I would say yes. And it, you know, and there's the broad lack of trust in institutions. And if we can't if we can't agree on, you know, on larger things, if we can't agree on what constitutes sort of trustworthy entities, then yes, it becomes hard to produce a knowledge and have that disseminate and be widely accepted. And, you know, part of this, it may be we have much more distributed knowledge. We have people being able to gather. There's far more voices out there than ever before, which are all really great things. And I think we have to kind of rethink how we generate knowledge, how we build consensus in more inclusive ways in society now, and also understand that yes, there are. It's very easy now to fall into kind of an alternative reality community, where, you know, people are being sort of actively recruited and sort of brought down the rabbit hole, and where you can create an entire, you know, framework where people feel quite comfortable in that. Fortunately, that's a small percentage of people, but you can see how that sort of happens, and people can sort of feel very happy in the warm embrace of this community where they feel like I'm seeing the real truth because everyone else there is missing it. They're the sheep and I'm the one who's seeing it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we have some fundamental challenges to think about in terms of reimagining and rethinking trust and consensus building in ways that are more opening and transparent and inclusive.
I think it definitely speaks to holding journalists to a higher standard, and journalists holding themselves to a very high standard as well, because there is that lack of trust. There is this sense that, you know, all these different parties in society, whether it's the government or the media or what you read on Facebook, you know, it's hard to know what to trust. So I think, you know, as the media collectively, we have to be setting a very high bar to separate ourselves from all the other junk that's on the internet. And that means, you know, not getting things wrong. That means not having corrections. That means making sure your stories are balanced and thorough and nuanced every single time. And I think that's harder than ever in a time when, you know, there is that pressure in the news cycle to be churning out content. And a lot of media outlets are just struggling to get enough numbers to stay afloat, right? So it's definitely a challenging time, but I think we just have to hold ourselves to that standard. I also have to apologize. I have a radio deadline coming up, so I actually have to bid you all goodbye to go hit that. But thank you for such an insightful discussion today.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lauren. It's been great to have you.
Take care, guys. Thank you.
Great, Alfred.
Yeah, if I jump in there, I think that there's also a question that we have, you know, we have political leaders who foster distrust in some of our democratic institutions, including the media. So that is part of undermining the knowledge system that we have. And these political leaders have an interest in doing that, because then they say, the only person you can trust is me. I'm the only one giving you the facts. And so it's sort of self-reinforcing. And there's an interest from these political leaders to undermine trust in these democratic institutions. And that's the context in which then journalists are operating, reporting when there are people there who are trying to undermine your very own legitimacy.
Yes.
And just to add to what Alfred and Craig mentioned, as well as Lauren, when it comes to journalists working with higher standards, I think they really need to be non-partisan, so holding everyone accountable from different political parties, and that's really important to restoring some of the trust in the news media. Another thing, I think Craig mentioned consensus, and that's probably something that could bridge the different groups. I believe that seeking scientific consensus about different issues is really important. That would help us get together. We also call this collective intelligence, which means, you know, a majority of experts in the field agree on a certain things. So I think if we follow this, we can bridge different groups, and I think we will have less divisive society. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that's something that scientists working in, on climate change have kind of come to realize and have used now effectively. I don't know if effectively in creating social change, but in communicating as a single voice, I think in that way, this is kind of, they undersign this as a common knowledge base. So I think that's a very good point. So we're running out of time and we still have a lot of questions. So I want to thank the audience for all the questions. This has been a great discussion. I think we may have time for one last, and I really apologize to the audience because I see some really amazing and very kind of timely questions here. So I'm going to read, this is from David Murphy. How do you think the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter will affect freedom of speech? Yeah.
So
Go ahead, Alfred.
No, Ahmed, please go ahead.
I mean, I'm trying to be here a bit sarcastic because, I don't like Elon Musk, but I think the point he's making is Elon Musk move is to gain and profit more, especially when it comes to his political influence. I don't think he really cares about freedom of expression or freedom of speech. For him, he really is trying to have more political outreach and influence in the world. I believe it's just like another marketing tactic or strategic marketing is, let's say, move he's making. Yeah, thank you.
I would add to that to say that I think the way Elon Musk has talked about free speech is very much in a US-centric way. And of course, Twitter is not a US-only platform. It's a global platform, and free speech operates in very different ways. So I suspect he's going to have a team around him saying, no, we can't do that because it's illegal in Germany. No, we can't do that because it's illegal in the UK. No, we can't do that because it's illegal in India. This is a much more complex issue. And I think in some ways, what makes this interesting is the answer is we don't know what's going to happen. And with Elon Musk, that seems to be the prevailing wisdom. You never know what he's going to do.
Well, thank you so much. I do want to kind of really thank the panelists. Lauren had to leave, but all of you for taking the time to being here today. It's been such a pleasure, such an honor to have you. I wish we had been, in a physical space so we could have now all had, additional conversations. But I do know all the panelists are online on Twitter. And so please, if anybody has additional information, questions, reach out to them. I know they'll be delighted to hear from you. And, we can applaud loud, but I can applaud. So thank you so much. And thanks for everybody for attending this event. And there will be another event and I will send out the information and hope you can all make it. And with that, I'm just going to say bye to everybody.